Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Psalm 2 Bible study. I'm going to keep this one under 5 minutes. I know that the last one was I haven't edited it yet, but I'm sure it was over 10 minutes. So we're going to try to do better. This is the 5-minute Bible study. Psalm 2 today, a very important psalm. If you want the outline, you can download it for free on our website at tobelikechrist.com. First, let's talk about the author. Now, the author is not specifically stated in the text, but many people believe that it was King David, who was the second king over Israel and Judah after King Saul. He lived around 1100 to 1000 BC. New Testament references. This one is referenced quite a few times in the New Testament. I was just teaching through Acts in the Sunday morning Bible class at our church, and we came across a reference to this psalm. It's referenced in Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 13, Revelation chapter 2, and Hebrews chapter 1 and chapter 5. This chapter is all about God's anointed one. So that brings us to our themes. Our themes, the rulers of earthly nations oppose God's anointed one, God's chosen king. God's chosen king, though, cannot be defeated by these earthly rulers. He reigns in superiority to all other kings. His allies find refuge in him, but his enemies will ultimately find their destruction in him. For our definition section, I've just got one term to define, and that's the term Zion. Zion is a name that refers to the hill or to the mountain where David's palace was built in Jerusalem. Now, this area was on the southeast side of what the larger city of Jerusalem would become. Zion is also sometimes used to refer to the city of Jerusalem collectively, as a whole. It's also used sometimes just to refer to the collective group of God's people. Zion was where the power was located in the nation of Israel, because that's where the king was. There are 12 verses in this chapter, and I've got them all under one section heading, God's anointed cannot be overthrown by the kings of the earth. So the psalmist begins by describing how the kings of the earth often oppose God's will, God's plan, what he's doing in the earth. Specifically, they oppose his anointed one. You'll notice that that's capitalized in most versions. We'll come back to that in our application section. These earthly kings, the enemies of God, they plot to overthrow God's plans. They want to do things their way. They don't want to listen to God's instructions or submit to his laws. But God laughs at their schemes and their plots because they're never going to succeed against him. So much of the Old Testament is about how people plot against God, but God always wins in the end. God decreed that his king, the king that he anointed, would be king in Zion. Now, if this is written by David, then obviously it's talking about David. David was going to be king. None of his enemies were going to overthrow him. And as I mentioned, Zion was the central location of the kingdom of Israel. David was on the throne there, and he was not going to be toppled. Now, really interestingly, God says something about his anointed one. It says about his king, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." That's in verse 7. And the psalmist writes that anyone who opposes God is going to be smashed to pieces like pottery that's struck by an iron rod. And the psalmist concludes by telling these kings of the earth that they need to ally with God and find their protection in him, because if they oppose him, ultimately they are going to be the target of his wrath and they're going to be destroyed. And so that is Psalm chapter 2, a really important psalm all about God, his anointed king, and how God's plans are going to succeed. Now that takes us into our application section. This psalm, and others that we'll encounter as we read the book of Psalms, has a dual prophetic meaning. The Holy Spirit inspired the writer of some of these psalms to write about God, what God was planning to do in the future. So it has a meaning, in the day that it was written, but it also has a future meaning. And Psalm 2 is a great example of a psalm like this. There is a sense in which David was a son of God, and it's definitely true that many enemies schemed against David, hoping to topple him from his throne, to throw him down, to throw down the kingdom of Israel that God was using to fulfill his will. The psalm is true of David, but it has a greater and fuller fulfillment in future events, namely in the life of Jesus. Jesus is the Son of God. He is the king who was opposed by the kings and the powers of the earth. The nations raged against him, hoping to destroy him. He is the king who God set on the throne to rule over his people, and his rule cannot be opposed. Now, this isn't just me making this up and kind of applying it forward, but rather the apostles even talk about Psalm chapter 2 being fulfilled in Jesus. The nations, namely Rome and the Jewish leaders, raged against Jesus and their rulers. Pontius Pilate, the high priest, Herod, they all fought against Jesus. They tried to destroy him. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful, just as the psalm predicts. The Son of God reigns as the anointed king over not only the nation of Israel, but the entire world. He offers refuge to those who ally with him through the salvation that he offers, but he also tells us that he will crush anyone who opposes him eventually, like an iron rod against a clay pot.